When Karen, an outspoken woman known for her blunt opinions, spots a weathered man in a veteran's jacket asking for donations at a local event, she scoffs. Approaching him, she accuses him of seeking pity and declares, "You're not a hero." Her words draw sharp gasps from bystanders. But as the veteran calmly begins to tell his story, Karen's confidence starts to crack. Each truth he reveals about his life and sacrifices takes her on a soul-shaking journey, shattering her preconceptions and leaving her questioning everything. Karen's day began like any other, rushed, chaotic, and peppered with annoyances. She had errands to run, deadlines to meet, and absolutely no patience for distractions. Yet, as she passed through the town square, her attention was caught by a small crowd gathered around a man seated near the park fountain. He wore a battered military jacket, its faded patches barely legible, and sat beside a cardboard sign that read, "Help Veterans in Need." She hesitated, her gaze drawn to the scene. A tin can, littered with coins and a few crumpled bills, sat at his feet. The man, his beard silver and his face marked with lines of age and hardship, spoke in a steady, calm voice, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured to the audience. Karen rolled her eyes. "Unbelievable," she muttered, her tone laced with disdain. Adjusting the strap of her designer handbag, she walked closer, her heels clicking sharply against the cobblestone path. The murmurs of the crowd reached her ears, sympathetic voices, nods of approval, the occasional jingling of coins as someone dropped money into the tin. It all grated against her nerves. To Karen, this man was another charlatan, another opportunist exploiting goodwill for an easy payout. Her scoff was audible this time, drawing attention from those around her. Several heads turned her way, but Karen, ever unapologetic, strode directly toward the veteran. The man's steady voice faltered as she stopped in front of him, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Why should we give you money?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "What makes you so special?" The crowd fell silent. The man looked up at her, his eyes calm but piercing. He didn't flinch under her gaze, didn't recoil from her hostility. Instead, he simply adjusted his posture, as though preparing for a conversation he had expected but dreaded. "I'm not asking for myself," he said, his voice tinged with both weariness and dignity. "This is for the men and women who've served our country, for those who are struggling to survive." Karen's lips curled into a scornful smile. Struggling? Or looking for an easy way out? Wearing a uniform doesn't automatically make you a hero. A ripple of disapproval ran through the crowd. Some people murmured objections under their breath. Others simply stared at Karen appalled. But she was unmoved. She had spent her life speaking her mind, and if her words made her unpopular, so be it. The man, however, didn't react as she expected. There was no anger, no defensiveness in his expression. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying her with a quiet intensity that made her uncomfortable. Finally, he let out a soft, almost inaudible sigh. "Not a hero, huh?" he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's fair. You don't know me, so why would you think otherwise?" Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off by his response. She had expected an argument, perhaps a diatribe about patriotism and sacrifice. Instead, the man gestured toward the bench beside him. "Why don't you stay for a bit?" he offered. "Let me tell you a story, and if you still feel the same way afterward, well, maybe I'll learn something from you." Karen hesitated. Part of her wanted to walk away, to avoid what she assumed would be a tedious lecture about duty and honor. But there was something in his tone, something calm yet firm, quiet yet commanding. That intrigued her. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "Fine," she said, her tone brusque. "I'll listen, but don't expect me to change my mind." The veteran nodded, unbothered by her skepticism. As she leaned against a nearby lamppost, arms still crossed, he began to speak. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that made the crowd lean in closer, their expressions rapt. Karen, however, remained defiant, determined not to be swayed. But as the man began his tale, painting vivid pictures of courage, loss, and resilience, she felt something stir within her, a faint crack in the wall of cynicism she had built around herself. She ignored it, telling herself it was nothing. After all, she thought, how could this man, this beggar in a faded jacket, possibly teach her anything she didn't already know? The veteran's voice cut through the park's noise, a calm, deliberate cadence that drew Karen's unwilling attention. "My name is Thomas," he began. "I was 21 when I enlisted. Back then, I thought I was invincible. The world seemed like a puzzle I could solve if I just worked hard enough." Karen resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Every story started the same way, didn't it? A young idealist chasing glory, only to realize the world wasn't as noble as they'd imagined. Yet Thomas's tone was different, matter-of-fact, devoid of melodrama. "My family didn't have much," Thomas continued. "We lived paycheck to paycheck. Joining the military seemed like the only way to secure a future. But I wasn't doing it just for me. My younger sister, Emily, was sick, a congenital heart defect. Treatments were expensive, and my parents were drowning in medical bills. When the recruiter talked about bonuses, I thought, this is how I can help." Karen shifted her weight, her skepticism waning slightly. She had grown up in comfort, never worrying about financial ruin. The idea of a 21-year-old shouldering such responsibility felt foreign to her. "Boot camp was tough," Thomas said, a faint smile crossing his lips. "They break you down to build you up. But it was nothing compared to deployment. My first was to Afghanistan. The heat, the dust, the waiting. It was like stepping into another world. Then there were the people. Kids, mostly, looking at us with fear and curiosity. Some were friendly, others not so much." He paused, his eyes distant. "I remember the first time we got ambushed. We were on a routine patrol, nothing out of the ordinary. Then bullets started flying. You don't have time to think, training takes over. I ended up in a ditch with two other guys, Garcia and Reynolds. Garcia was hit bad. Reynolds and I tried to stop the bleeding, but he—" Thomas's voice faltered, the first crack in his calm demeanor. Karen felt a tightening in her chest but refused to let it show. "We called for medevac, but it took too long. Garcia didn't make it. He was 22, just a kid. That was the first time I realized how fragile life is. You train, you prepare, but nothing readies you for war's reality. It changes you." Karen found herself leaning forward, her resistance eroding. She could hear the emotion in Thomas's voice, see the weight of his memories in his posture. Yet she clung to skepticism. Wasn't this just another sob story? Thomas seemed to sense her doubt. "You don't have to believe me," he said, meeting her gaze. "But this is my truth. Every decision I made, every sacrifice, was for someone else. My family, my brothers in arms, even strangers back home who'd never know my name." Karen swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. The crowd around them remained silent, captivated by Thomas's words. For the first time, Karen felt a flicker of something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity, it was deeper. Before she could dwell on it, Thomas continued. "After Garcia, I made a promise. I'd do whatever it took to bring my guys home, and I did. But the cost—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "The cost was higher than I ever imagined." Karen didn't know what to say. For once, her sharp tongue failed her. As Thomas began again, she realized she wasn't just listening to a story. She was witnessing a piece of someone's soul. Thomas's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of loss. Karen didn't dare meet his gaze, afraid of what she might find in his eyes. Yet, as much as she wanted to dismiss him, to label his story as exaggerated, she couldn't look away. There was something undeniable in his tone, rawness that struck a chord. Thomas took a deep breath before continuing. "After Garcia, I thought about quitting. I wanted to come home, to leave it all behind. But you can't just walk away, not from the military and not from the people who depend on you. We were more than a unit. We were family. And when you're out there, you learn quickly that family doesn't leave each other behind. Karen's skepticism surfaced, though weaker now. "But isn't that what you signed up for?" she asked quietly. "You knew the risks, didn't you?" Thomas nodded. "We all knew. But knowing doesn't make it easier. When you're holding a friend in your arms, watching the light fade from their eyes, it doesn't matter how prepared you thought you were. The reality is worse." He paused, glancing at the crowd. Some nodded in silent agreement. Others looked away. Karen felt a pang of guilt, but quickly pushed it aside. "We kept going," Thomas said, "because that's what you do. You put one foot in front of the other, even when every step feels impossible. For me, it was Emily. Every letter she wrote reminded me why I was there. She called me her hero, said she was proud of me." Karen's heart clenched at the mention of his sister. She could picture a young girl, fragile and full of hope, clinging to the idea of her brother as a savior. The thought unsettled her. "Did she—" Karen started but hesitated. "Did she survive?" Thomas's face softened, and for the first time Karen saw a glimmer of something brighter in his eyes. "Yes, the surgery was a success. She's married now, with kids." A wave of relief washed over Karen. "So, at least something good came out of it," she murmured. Thomas nodded, but his faint smile quickly faded. "Yeah, but it came at a cost. I lost more than friends out there. I lost pieces of myself." Karen frowned. "What do you mean?" "I came back, but I wasn't the same," he admitted. "None of us were. You spend so long in survival mode you forget how to live. And when you come home you realize the world moved on without you. The people you fought for, the ones you thought you were protecting, they don't even notice you're gone." His words stung, though Karen couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because she was one of those people, the kind who lived her life without sparing a thought for others' sacrifices. Thomas looked down at his hands, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I tried to fit back in. Got a job, went to therapy, did all the things they tell you to do. But it wasn't enough. The nightmares, the guilt, it never goes away. You carry it every day." Karen felt a lump in her throat but swallowed it. She didn't want to admit his story was affecting her. Yet, as she listened, she realized her judgment had been shallow. Thomas glanced at her. "You said I'm not a hero," he said softly. "And maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not. But I didn't do it to be a hero. I did it because someone had to." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, she was at a loss. All she could do was stand there, staring at the man who had laid bare his soul for all to see. Karen stood frozen, the weight of Thomas's words sinking deeper than she cared to admit. The murmur of the crowd barely registered as she replayed his last statement. Someone had to. She couldn't help but wonder how many sacrifices like his went unnoticed by people like her. Thomas shifted slightly, sensing her turmoil. "There was one mission," he began, "that defined everything for me. We were supposed to extract civilians from a village overtaken by insurgents." The crowd leaned in, and Karen found herself doing the same, despite the resistance she tried to maintain. Thomas's gaze was distant, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. "It was supposed to be straightforward," he said. "Get in, secure the hostages, and get out. But everything went wrong." Karen noticed the tremor in his hands as he spoke, though he seemed oblivious. His voice remained steady, reliving a chapter he could never close. "The enemy was waiting for us," he continued. "They had set traps. We lost 3 men in the first 10 minutes. Then we realized the intel was wrong. It wasn't just a few hostages. It was an entire village." Karen's chest tightened. The chaos, the fear, The impossible choices they must have faced felt overwhelming, even in her imagination. There were children, Thomas said, his voice cracking. Families hiding in basements. The enemy had fortified their positions, turning the village into a death trap. Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to interrupt, to say something, anything, but couldn't. "We had to make a choice," Thomas said, his tone heavy. "Stay and try to evacuate them, knowing we might not make it out alive, or pull back and leave them to their fate." The crowd was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Karen's breath caught in her throat as she waited for him to continue. "We stayed," Thomas said simply. "We couldn't leave them. So, we fought. Somehow, by some miracle, we held the line long enough to get most of them out." Karen's chest tightened. "Most," she whispered before she could stop herself. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with an ache so profound it made her flinch. "Not all," he admitted. "We did our best, but some didn't make it, and neither did some of us." He paused, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. "I lost my best friend that day. Reynolds. He kept me going after Garcia. He made me believe we could make it through anything. And then he was gone." Karen felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had no right to cry, not for a man she had judged so harshly. "After that mission, I stopped believing in heroes," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. "Heroes don't leave people behind. Heroes don't make mistakes. But I did." Karen wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he had done more than anyone could expect, but the words wouldn't come. Thomas stood, his movements slow. "That's enough for today," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you for listening." The crowd began to disperse, some murmuring gratitude, others wiping away tears. Karen remained rooted in place, her thoughts chaotic. For the first time, she felt the weight of her ignorance. As Thomas turned to leave, Karen called out, "Wait," her voice trembling. "Can we talk more? I want to understand." Thomas paused, glancing over his shoulder. His expression unreadable, he nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. "Same time, same place." And with that, he walked away, leaving Karen alone with a story that shattered her preconceptions and forced her to confront truths she had ignored. Karen couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, Thomas's words replayed in her mind. She tried to push them away, but the harder she tried, the more persistent they became. By morning, she resolved to meet him again, not because she felt guilty, she told herself, but because she wanted to understand. When she arrived at the park the next day, Thomas was already there, sitting on the same bench. The tin can was gone, replaced by a weathered notebook on his lap. He looked up as she approached, his face calm but unreadable. "You came back," he said simply. Karen hesitated before sitting down beside him. "I said I would." Thomas nodded and opened the notebook, flipping through messy handwriting. Karen caught glimpses of lists and journal entries. He stopped, stared, then closed the book. "I wasn't sure you would," he admitted. Karen shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't sure, either." They sat in silence, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. Finally, Karen broke the quiet. "Why do you do it?" she asked. "Why tell your story to strangers like this?" Thomas leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Because people need to hear it. Most of the men and women I served with never got the chance to tell their stories. They're forgotten, lost in statistics. I don't want that to happen to them." Karen looked at him, trying to process his words. "But doesn't it hurt, reliving it all?" "Every time," Thomas said. "But it's worth it if one person walks away understanding what it costs to live in a free country. It's not about guilt. It's about awareness." Karen looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of his words. "I never thought about it that way," she admitted. Thomas smiled faintly. "Most people don't. It's easier not to." The conversation drifted, and Thomas shared lighter stories, moments of camaraderie and humor that helped his unit survive the darkest times. Karen found herself laughing despite the heaviness in her chest. For the first time, she saw Thomas not just as a veteran, but as a person. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Thomas grew quiet again. "There's something else I want to show you," he said, reaching into his bag. He pulled out a folded American flag, its edges frayed with age. "This was Reynolds," he explained, his voice softer now. "It was draped over his casket before they sent him home. His family gave it to me. They said he would have wanted me to have it." Karen stared at the flag, her throat tightening. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because you said I'm not a hero," Thomas replied, his tone gentle. "And maybe I'm not. But Reynolds was, and so were the others who didn't make it back. If nothing else, they deserved to be remembered." Karen couldn't speak. The weight of his words, of the flag in his hands, pressed down on her. She realized this wasn't about her opinion or guilt. It was about acknowledging a truth she had been blind to see. As Thomas carefully folded the flag again, Karen reached out, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what I said, for what I assumed. I was wrong." Thomas looked at her, his expression kind but firm. "It's not about being sorry," he said. "It's about understanding. That's all I ask." Karen nodded, her chest tight with emotion. For the first time, she felt a deep respect for someone she had once dismissed. She realized she still had so much to learn. As she walked away that evening, Karen knew she would be back, not just to hear more of Thomas's story, but to honor it, and to carry it with her in a way that would make a difference. Karen returned to the park the next day, a mixture of anticipation and unease swirling in her chest. Thomas was there as promised, sitting in his usual spot, the notebook on his lap. This time, she didn't hesitate. She sat beside him, her heart heavy with questions she couldn't yet articulate. "You're back," Thomas said. Karen nodded. "I couldn't stay away." Thomas smiled faintly. "It's not easy to confront your assumptions." Karen glanced at him, surprised by his insight. "No, it's not," she admitted. "But I want to understand. Really understand." Thomas leaned back, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then I'll tell you another story," he said. "This one's about coming home." Karen stayed quiet, her attention fully on him. "When you're deployed, all you think about is getting home. You count the days, the hours. But no one tells you that home doesn't feel the same when you get there. You think you're stepping back into your old life, but that life is gone. And so are parts of you." Karen's chest tightened. She could hear the rawness in his voice, the weight of experience that made his words impossible to dismiss. "I came back to a world that didn't know me anymore," Thomas continued. "My parents were proud, my sister was relieved, but they didn't understand. How could they? I didn't know how to talk about the things I'd seen, the things I'd done, so I didn't." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the bench. "Instead, I tried to be normal. Got a job, went to family gatherings, laughed at jokes. But it all felt hollow. I kept waiting to feel like myself again, but it never came." Karen swallowed hard. She had imagined veterans returning to parades and warm embraces. She had never thought about what came after. "The worst part," Thomas said quietly, "is the guilt. You carry it everywhere. You wonder why you made it home when so many others didn't. You ask yourself if you deserve the life you're living, and the answer never feels like yes." Karen looked down at her hands, her throat tight. "I can't imagine," she said softly. Thomas glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "No, you can't, and that's okay. But what you can do is listen. Understand. That's all we want. To know what we did mattered, that we're not invisible." Karen nodded, his words sinking deep. "What helped you?" she asked after a moment. Thomas sighed, leaning forward. "A lot of things. Therapy, my family, the friends who stuck around when I couldn't be who they remembered. But mostly, it was finding a purpose. That's why I'm here, telling my story. It's not for me. It's for them. For the ones who didn't make it back. For the ones still fighting their battles. Karen felt a lump form in her throat. She had come to the park expecting answers, but instead, she was faced with more questions. About herself, about her perceptions, about the world she had taken for granted. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas gave her a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to say anything. Just keep coming back." Karen nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't sure what she could do, but she knew she had to try. As she walked away that evening, the weight of Thomas's story settled over her like a blanket. It was heavy, but it was also warm, filled with the quiet strength of a man who had lost so much but refused to let it define him. And, for the first time, Karen began to understand what it truly meant to be a hero. Karen's visits to the park became a routine. Each day she returned, drawn to Thomas's stories and eager to understand the life he had lived. The skepticism she once carried had faded, replaced by a deep respect and curiosity. One afternoon, as they sat together, Karen noticed Thomas staring at his notebook. His fingers traced its worn edges, his expression distant. "What's in there?" she asked gently. "Memories," he replied. "Some I wrote down. Others I couldn't." Karen hesitated. "Would you share one?" Thomas flipped through the pages, stopping at one. He handed her the book, and Karen leaned in to read. The page was dated 3 years earlier and contained only a brief entry. "Saw Garcia's mother today. She thanked me for being with him in the end. Told me he talked about his little sister before he died. I didn't have the heart to tell her how scared he was. She deserves to believe he was at peace." Karen felt her throat tighten. She looked up at Thomas, unsure of what to say. "You carry so much," she whispered. Thomas closed the notebook. "We all do," he said simply. "That's why we need each other. Civilians mean well, but they can't understand." Karen nodded slowly, her guilt growing. She couldn't deny his truth. "Do you ever feel angry?" she asked hesitantly. "At people like me, who don't get it?" Thomas considered her question. "Not angry. Frustrated, maybe. It's hard to explain to people who've never lived it. But I don't blame anyone. I just wish more people cared enough to try." Karen felt a pang in her chest. She had spent so much of her life indifferent to sacrifices others had made. "I'm trying now," she said softly. Thomas gave her a small smile. "That's all anyone can ask." They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the park filling the air. Karen's gaze drifted back to the notebook. "Do you share these stories with anyone else?" Thomas shook his head. "Not often. Most people don't want to hear them. They'd rather pretend everything's fine." "That's not right," Karen said firmly. "People need to hear this. They need to understand what you've been through." Thomas sighed. "It's not easy. People don't like being uncomfortable. And the truth about war? It's not easy to hear." Karen's mind raced. She thought about the impact Thomas's stories could have. "What if you could tell them?" she asked. "Not just here, but to more people. Write a book, or speak at schools or events?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Me? I'm not a writer. Public speaking isn't my thing." Karen leaned forward, her excitement growing. "You don't have to do it alone. I could help. Write it with you, organize talks. People need to hear what you have to say." Thomas looked at her, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "You'd do that?" Karen nodded. "It's the least I can do." For the first time, Karen saw a glimmer of hope in Thomas's eyes. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time to tell the whole story." As they talked about possibilities, Karen felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known before. She realized Thomas's story wasn't just about him. It was about all the men and women like him, whose voices deserved to be heard. Karen had never seen herself as a storyteller, but Thomas's willingness to let her help ignited something in her. Over the next few weeks, the park bench became their shared workspace. Thomas recounted memories while Karen took notes, often struggling to capture the depth of his experiences. Together, they began weaving his life into a narrative, a story of survival, sacrifice, and resilience. One crisp autumn afternoon, Thomas shared a memory that left Karen silent. He described being stationed at a remote outpost, tasked with holding the line against an enemy that outnumbered his unit 3-1. Supplies were scarce, and morale was lower still. "I remember the nights most clearly," Thomas said. "The silence stretched on forever, broken only by distant gunfire. We were all scared, though none of us admitted it. You don't. But fear, it becomes part of you." Karen paused her note-taking. "How did you keep going?" Thomas looked at her, his eyes steady. "Because we had to. People were depending on us. Giving up wasn't an option. It's amazing what you can endure when you don't have a choice." Karen nodded. "That's powerful," she murmured. "People need to hear that. Not just the battles, but the moments in between. The quiet struggles most of us never see." Thomas leaned back, a faint smile on his lips. "You're better at this than you think." Karen felt a warmth rise in her chest. She had started this project to help Thomas, but it was helping her too. For the first time in years, she felt a part of something meaningful. But not everyone shared her enthusiasm. One evening, she shared her progress with a friend who met her with skepticism. "Why are you spending so much time on this?" her friend asked. "People don't care about these stories. They want entertainment, not guilt trips." Karen bristled. "It's not about guilt. It's about awareness, about giving someone a voice who deserves to be heard." Her friend shrugged. "Maybe. But don't be surprised if no one listens." The words stung, but Karen refused to let them shake her resolve. The next day, she shared the conversation with Thomas. His reaction surprised her. "They're not wrong," he said. "A lot of people won't listen. Some will criticize you for trying, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." Karen frowned. "How do you stay so calm about it?" Thomas shrugged. "You focus on the ones who do care. Even if it's just one person, that's enough. That's who you do it for." Karen absorbed his words, her determination renewed. Over the following weeks, their work took shape. The stories flowed, and Karen began reaching out to local organizations. Slowly, doors began to open. Their first speaking engagement was at a small community center. Thomas was nervous, his hands trembling as he took the stage. But once he began to speak, the room fell silent. He told his story with the same raw honesty he had shared with Karen, and by the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. As they left the center that evening, Thomas turned to Karen. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I never thought I'd do something like this." Karen smiled. "You've always had the words. You just needed someone to help you share them." For the first time, Karen felt like they were truly making a difference. She knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and not everyone would understand. But for Thomas, and countless others, it was a road worth walking. Thomas's words were reaching more people than he had ever imagined. Karen watched as invitations to speak poured in. Schools, community centers, even a local news station. Each time, Thomas spoke with raw honesty, leaving audiences deeply moved. But with the growing attention came growing challenges. After a particularly emotional talk at a high school, Karen found Thomas lingering outside the auditorium. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and his shoulders were tight. "You okay?" she asked gently. Thomas nodded but avoided her gaze. "It's harder than I thought," he admitted. "Talking about it over and over, it's like reliving it every time." Karen frowned. "I thought it was helping." "It is," he said, "but it's also exhausting. Some days it feels like I'm dragging those memories around all over again." Karen placed a hand on his arm. "Thomas, you don't have to do this. No one would blame you if you stopped." He shook his head. "No, this matters. People need to hear it. But I think I need to figure out how to carry it without letting it drag me down." Karen nodded, guilt tugging at her. She had encouraged him to share his story, never realizing the toll it might take. "We'll figure it out," she promised. "Together." That evening, Karen began researching resources for veterans. She found a nonprofit organization specializing in peer support and therapy. The next day, she showed Thomas the information. To her relief, he agreed to give it a try. In the weeks that followed, Karen noticed a change in Thomas. He seemed lighter, though the weight of his experiences would always be with him. They continued their work, but at a slower pace, allowing Thomas the space he needed to heal. One afternoon, as they sat on their familiar park bench, Thomas turned to Karen. "You've changed," he said. Karen blinked, surprised. "Me?" Thomas nodded. "When we met, you didn't even want to hear my story. Now you're making sure everyone else hears it." Karen smiled softly. "You changed me. I didn't realize how much I didn't understand until I met you." Thomas chuckled. "Funny how that works, isn't it?" Nearby, the laughter of children broke their conversation. Karen watched as a little girl ran to her father, who scooped her up and spun her around. The scene made her glance at Thomas, wondering if he was thinking about the lives he had fought to protect. "You ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Serving, I mean." Thomas didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady. "No, it wasn't easy, and I've lost more than I can ever get back. But if I had the chance to do it all over again, I would." Karen nodded, her chest tight with a mix of admiration and sadness. She knew she would never fully grasp the depth of his sacrifices, but she also knew she didn't need to. All she needed to do was listen, and help others do the same. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in golden light, Karen felt a quiet sense of purpose. Their journey wasn't over, but they had come so far. For the first time, she believed they could handle whatever came next. The auditorium was packed, the hum of anticipation palpable as Karen adjusted the microphone. This was the biggest event she and Thomas had prepared for, a veterans conference with hundreds in attendance. Thomas stood beside her, clutching his notebook, his expression calm but focused. "You ready?" Karen whispered. Thomas nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Karen stepped back as he approached the microphone. The room fell silent, every eye on him. Thomas began, his voice steady. "I never thought I'd be here," he started. "For a long time, I didn't think anyone wanted to hear what I had to say. I thought my story ended the day I came home. But I've learned that some stories don't end. They grow, they change, until you can't ignore them anymore." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "When I was deployed, I believed I was fighting for freedom, for justice, for everything we hold dear, and I was. But I was also fighting for the men beside me, for the friends who became family, and for the hope that we'd all make it home. Not all of us did." Thomas's voice wavered, but he pressed on. "Coming back was harder than I ever imagined. I felt lost, disconnected, like no one could understand. But then, someone did." Karen's chest tightened as Thomas gestured toward her. "Karen taught me that sharing our stories matters, that even if one person listens, it's enough. Because when we share, we bridge the gaps between us. We remind each other that we're not alone." The room was utterly silent, every pair of eyes fixed on him. Thomas closed his notebook and set it aside. "I want to leave you with this," he said. "We all have the power to make a difference, whether it's by listening, sharing, or simply showing up. It doesn't have to be grand. Sometimes it's the smallest actions that mean the most." The applause began softly but swelled into a roar as Thomas stepped back. Karen met him at the edge of the stage, her eyes glistening. "You did it," she said. Thomas smiled, his face lighter than she had ever seen. "We did it." As they left the auditorium, the cool evening air greeted them. Thomas paused under the night sky, gazing upward. "You know," he said, "I used to think the world moved on without us. But maybe we're not meant to catch up. Maybe we're meant to help others slow down." Karen smiled, her heart full. "I think you're right." They stood in silence, the stars shining above them, before walking into the night. Their journey wasn't over, but for the first time, both felt truly at peace.